Hello everyone, today we talk about the French invasion of the Netherlands in 1672 as the first or disaster year, as it was known in Dutch Rampjaar, of the 1672-78 war that at some point we can look at in its whole development, this first year being incredibly momentous because of the massive French and Allied, including, as we'll see now, also English, for example, attack on the Dutch Republic that at this point faced an existential crisis, known in fact as the Rampjaar in Dutch historiography. We are looking at a formidable coalition led by France under King Louis XIV. Made a video a couple of years ago looking at his warfare, his era in the art of war. We will surely make more videos about his reign and wars. We talked about him, if anything, for the series about Vienna, right? The relations with the Habsburgs, with the Poles. Sun King that in this war was allied with England, as we explained before, which is a bit different, of course, from the later developments in international European balance of powers. I also made a video about the sort of infantry firepower doctrine from the War of the League of Augsburg onward. Again, lots of videos on this area. We also covered it in the video about the French musketeers of the royal house, and so on. Coalition, again, also counting the bishopric of Münster, the electorate of Cologne. We will look how these powers operated. In fact, they altogether launched this meticulously planned invasion to dismantle the well-entrenched republic that will, in fact, big spoiler in case you didn't notice, we still have the Netherlands, withstood this onslaught. Right, and let's say essentially witness to a period of great military development. The Dutch army between the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century, in terms of cost benefits, in its strictly financial sense, is actually the most effective army in military history that we can recall, even though indeed the Dutch were not sort of a major power, if not, for example, economically speaking. In fact, despite its small size, the Dutch were a global economic titan. Their wealth derived from trade, shipping, and naval supremacy. However, their land defenses were woefully neglected, their army underfunded at this point, and in fact, their political fabric torn, as we will see now, and this was actually the greatest danger, even more than the strongest army in Europe at that point invading you, torn by factionalism between the regent-led States Party and the Orangists supporting William III. The French invasion, executed with overwhelming force and strategic precision, exploited the aforementioned weaknesses, swiftly occupying much of the Republic's territory that had truly to struggle for its life. Yet, Dutch resilience, spearheaded by the young William III of Orange, combined with ingenious defensive tactics like inundations of their own territory by breaking the dams, let's say difficultly, as you know, created by reclaiming land from the seas since the Middle Ages, but still they would be rebuilt. Naval victories, that was a very important aspect of the war, because here again the English and the Dutch in particular, as sort of the rampant naval commercial powers in Northern Europe, are really competitive with one another, and the Dutch were, at least initially, the best force. And diplomatic maneuvering as well halted the advance of the conflict into a grueling war of attrition. Just think even the sizes of the Netherlands and France, and even just their political stand in the international scene. You understand very well how geopolitics is a massive pile of BS that was specifically crafted for manipulating the mentally frail, brutally alienated from any slightest trace of awareness of the art of war. This video traces the invasion's chronological progression, weaving together military, political, and also social developments, especially in the Netherlands, into a comprehensive account of this defining moment in Dutch history that we will surely discuss more at some point. I still have, of course, to finish. We have just begun the series about the 80 Years' War. At some point, we will look at battles. You know how Schwerpunkt works at large. We'll, of course, enrich this with additional details to illuminate the broader context, human cost, cultural impact of the crisis of the Rampjaar. The origins of the war of 1672 lay in Louis XIV's ambition to secure what he called the quote-unquote natural frontiers for France. And he wasn't wrong in this. Like, the French had historically tried to conquer, if anything, hegemonize the Low Countries from quite a long time. We've seen it at the Battle of Courtrai. We've seen it with sort of a broader sort of historical background when indeed what was essentially forming as France had controlled a land that wasn't even up to this point in history particularly advanced per se, right? And it was actually securing its incredible achievement on the war stage exactly in this pivotal moment, also telling threats of annihilation. Unsurprisingly so, by the way. France was particularly involved, as we've seen also in the video about Louis XIV's warfare in general, and also in the series about Vienna and the issues with the Holy Roman Empire along the Rhine, right? Which required, in this sense, neutralizing the Dutch Republic to facilitate the conquest of the Spanish Netherlands. I presume you're sort of acquainted with the broader international scene. If we were to overly simplify this, it's obvious that France had been successfully consolidating as the first true modern state, not quite a contemporary nation state. That's what will actually stem from the same advancement of the French power during the following century. You know the story. We also talked about the issues of French military reform, deeply rooted in the same dynamic. In any case, there was east of France particularly fragmented reality in Germany, essentially, within the Holy Roman Empire, that the bigger power from medieval times had essentially tried to expand towards. And great part already of different wars in the past, for example, the Italian ones, stemmed from the necessity of, in fact, countering French expansionism. Under Louis XIV, France was coming back after some time, like the tendentially hegemonic continental power in Europe. I also recently made a video about at least the early phase of the Duke of Marlborough's campaigns. We will come back talking about Prince Eugene, so you know what we're talking about at large. Also made a video about Canada, from the League of Augsburg to the 7 Years' War. So if you're interested, there is starting from 1673. Today we don't talk about that. We stop to the 72. But also an American frontier, this clash. And France's diplomatic preparations were extensive and cunning in the typical style, in fact, of the Sun King, who reflected Louis's vision of himself as Europe's preeminent monarch, of which all the other states had to be satellites of. In June 1670, Louis secured England's allegiance through the secret Treaty of Dover, offering Charles II annual subsidies of £230,000 to bolster his absolutist ambitions, a 6,000-man brigade for the campaign, and the promise of Dutch coastal cities like Brill and Flushing to satisfy English commercial interests. Right. This is, of course, after the restoration, right, of the Stuarts. And Louis eventually, like, there is the Glorious Revolution, so we will see that, if anything, in another video. But at this point, the Stuarts, together with all their limits, were still particularly precious for the international policy of Louis XIV. They also shared blood and so on. Now, this alliance between the French and the English aimed to cripple Dutch trade, particularly the Dutch dominance in the Baltic and East Indian routes, which fueled England's envy, to say the least. Louis further enlisted the bishopric of Münster, led by the aggressive Christoph Bernhard von Galen, whose personal vendetta against the Dutch stemmed from territorial disputes, right? And the electorate of Cologne under Maximilian Henry of Bavaria, allowing French forces to bypass the Spanish Netherlands, literally across the Rhine, by advancing, in fact, through the bishopric of Liège as well. That was, in fact, a Cologne dependency. This aspect would be better detailed, like if we were to follow especially these minor polities goals and context. Naturally, we don't have all the time in the world, but this much is given. To isolate the Dutch further, Louis secured Swedish support to do what? Not much to intervene against the Netherlands, but to distract Brandenburg-Prussia, the Hohenzollern, that were potential Dutch allies. The Swedes, in fact, invaded Pomerania in April 1772, having been promised by Louis Swedish territorial gains and subsidies as a result of their assistance. These alliances left the Dutch diplomatically vulnerable, to say the least, as their earlier formation of the Triple Alliance with England and Sweden in 1668 to curb French expansion in the Spanish Netherlands had provoked Louis's wrath, setting the stage for his revenge. Basically, they were almost surrounded. The Dutch, lulled by a false sense of security, however, failed to anticipate the scale of this coalition. It's also something you have to understand in the broader political and social habit of the era. Nobody had really put together the forces that Louis XIV's France were capable of fielding for such an invasion. With their ambassador in Paris, Peter de Groot, the Dutch sent optimistic reports that underestimated French preparations for the same war. It's not like they didn't know what was happening, but they essentially underestimated this. We've seen it also for, the Ottoman siege of Vienna. That was yet to come. The Dutch Republic was woefully unprepared for the onslaught. There is no doubt about this. The first stadtholderless period, 1650-1672, dominated by the regent establishment under Grand Pensionary Johan de Witt, prioritizing naval power and commerce over land defenses, reflecting the Republic's identity primarily as a maritime power. The Dutch States Army, numbering fewer than 30,000 men, was scattered across southern fortresses like Breda, 's-Hertogenbosch, and Maastricht, many of which were undermanned, with garrisons as small as 100 men. It's not like, as also later campaigns in the same Low Countries, with hundreds, literally of thousands of troops often involved, would have it so easy against fortifications. It could be manned by relatively few troops, but this was significantly under strength for the era. Without mentioning that fortifications themselves, from a structural point of view, crumbled from decades of neglect. Political divisions between the States Party, advocating, quote, true freedom without a stadtholder, even, and the Orangists, who had a sort of a more monarchic dynastic bias and sought to restore, in fact, William III to power, paralyzed military reforms, contributing to the crippling of the Dutch forces. De Witt, a brilliant administrator but cautious about empowering the Orangists because possible coup, resisted increasing army budgets until February 1672, when William, age 22 at the time, was appointed Captain General for a year. Raising an army of 80,000 was a slow and contentious process, hampered by provincial autonomy, which was strong in the Dutch ethos, financial constraints that naturally stemmed from the same, and therefore general mistrust between Holland's wealthy regions and, for example, the inland provinces like Overijssel, Gelderland, which resented Holland's dominance in all this. So again, the Republic had to defend itself from the incoming French invasion, but at the same time, the people did not want to give too much power to the stadtholders. Key eastern fortresses like Rheinberg, Wesel, and Emmerich were inadequately defended, with commanders often lacking supplies, clear orders, or even accurate maps, which may seem strange considering sort of Dutch advancement and renaissance of this era, but still, it was in theory, right? And that's what is also most striking about the ultimate outcome and the success of the Netherlands of the same generations. The Dutch relied on the Triple Alliance's mutual defense clauses, still unaware of England's betrayal until March the 23rd of the same 1672, when the Royal Navy attacked a Dutch merchant convoy in the Channel, sinking or capturing 12 ships carrying wine and textiles. Formal declarations of war at that point followed from England, were on April the 17th, and France on April the 6th, because obviously it was obvious what kind of power worked behind the English scenes, shattering thus Dutch hopes of diplomatic reprieve and plunging the Republic into a veritable panic, because they figured out too late what the hell was going on. The French offensive began on May the 4th, with an army of 120,000 men supported by a logistical train that swelled its numbers to nearly 300,000, which is also a good measure for looking at armies in the past and saying, but how many of them were actually just fighting force? This is not necessarily the gold standard proportion, etc. But consider that up to this point, that is to say, literally Louis XIV's France, nobody had really ever centralized something so apparently banal like logistics. Basically, armies were habituated to gather resources through either private means or along the way. Louis XIV's France was the first power to actually establish an office that said, okay, how many troops are there, how much food do they need, and of course connecting with the broader administration, government, and so on to get things done. Among these 200,000, we see engineers, sappers, camp followers, all people that were actually useful to the point, and even royal chefs to cater to Louis' court, which is interesting because the sovereign, of course, visited the war zone, and this was still seen. It would be still an aristocratic activity up to very late in time as a sort of entertainment, basically. This force, one of the largest in European history, by the way, benefited from reforms by the Secretary of War Louvois, an incredibly powerful individual, enabling early spring campaigns, because even May the 4th in the Netherlands is not necessarily that warm, and sophisticated supply chains with mobile bakeries, prepositioned depots, and standardized muskets. This was the marvel of Louis XIV's France as this enormous ruler that was basically devoid of any specific command talent, but had a veritable reforming genius, right, and a massive capacities of organization could properly achieve, unlike basically any other opponent that era. Marshal Turenne, one of the greatest commanders in the firmament of military leaders, we still have to make a video about him, by the way, commanding 50,000 men from Charleroi, and Prince Condé, I made a video about him, if anything, I mentioned him among the greatest commanders of the 30 Years' War, and we talked about his exploit back then. Cousin of St. Louis, leading a subsidiary force from Sedan, converged at Visay on May the 17th, joined by Louis himself and his lavish court, who treated the campaign, as we explained, as a grand spectacle, complete with artists like Adam Frans van der Meulen to immortalize their victories in paintings and tapestries. They're also inserted among the images. The French faced a strategic dilemma, though, right? Because this operation, as big as it was, of course, was directed at equally ambitious objectives. Besieged Maastricht, a heavily fortified Dutch stronghold on the Meuse River with a garrison of 6,400 cannons, or advance along the Rhine, where defenses were weaker but supply lines longer. What would have you done? Well, Turenne, prioritizing speed to prevent Dutch consolidation, because of course the Republic was hurrying up, opted for the Rhine, leaving 10,000 men under the Comte de Guiche to cover Maastricht. Of course, the speed here referred to the fact that getting bogged down in a siege of such an important stronghold would have taken a large amount of time. Now, this decision outflanked the Dutch IJssel line. A series of fortifications along the IJssel River meant to block invasions from the east, but which was inadequately manned and poorly coordinated due to provincial rivalries and outdated maps, as we were hinting at before, that underestimated especially the Rhine's fording points that the French would have exploited. By early June, the French captured key Rhine fortresses, such as Rheinberg, Orsoy, Burich, and Wesel, with minimal resistance. There are also tapestries properly illustrating the French crossing of the Rhine in this sort of, on these fords where, in fact, horsemen could pass just by themselves. Wesel's surrender on June the 5th, prompted by civilian threats against its commanders who feared reprisals for resistance, was a critical loss, as it anchored the Dutch eastern defenses and controlled a vital Rhine crossing. In particular, the French crossed the Rhine at Emmerich, further exposing the Republic's frontier with local peasants resentful of Dutch taxes, occasionally guiding French scouts, right? Because it was not definitely a noble thing to see these Protestant powers in what was here, the Netherlands had de facto seceded from the Holy Roman Empire. We're talking essentially just the part of the broader Germany, backing France, counting on some local autonomy anyway from the same, to counter the Catholic Habsburgs, right? And this, of course, is much within the temper of the year. On June the 12th, at the Battle of Tolhuis near Lobith, Condé's corps of 15,000 exploited low river levels caused by a dry spring to ford the Rhine. This is not actually that small there, but still, again, environmentally speaking, allowed for this to happen, as we're mentioning. And Dutch forces, numbering fewer than 2,000, resisted fiercely, wounding Condé even in the worst, and killing the Duc de Longueville in cavalry skirmishes that saw Dutch dragoons that were, I think, since the 80 Years' War, in some functional sense, briefly disrupt French formations. These were mostly designed to carry out hit-and-run tactics. They had a bit abandoned the sort of rider mentality of the previous generations, but still were modulated along that pattern. This was mostly about gaining the, ground where the French could not pass, and therefore halting the invasion by sort of obstacling this vanguard. However, French numerical superiority, supported by pontoon bridges and Louis's personal observation from a nearby hill, overwhelmed the defenders, securing a foothold. This is one of the most delicate operations in warfare, river crossing, right? Because it doesn't matter how powerful you are, you must carry out things very orderly. Otherwise, the enemy from the other side, doesn't matter, how numerically small, can't really put you in a condition of inferiority that can engulf the entire operation. French propaganda, amplified by Gazette, engravings, and even medals struck in Paris, celebrated the crossing as a near mythical triumph, with Louis portrayed as a modern Caesar, right, as he crossed the Rhine to chastise these Germanics. In general, it's interesting to witness the mounting relevance of sort of public opinion, that especially in Paris, that was the most vivacious center in France, to say the least, the heart, the neuralgic center of any also espionage from the same Dutch, as we've seen also before the war. And considering that the Dutch themselves, so the English, for example, had, with their sort of tendentially Republican profiles, or increasingly Republican profiles, let's say a greater third estate saying in sort of political affairs, was all some sort of psychological warfare. The strategic impact of this Rhine crossing, however, was in fact more psychological, signaling the Republic's vulnerability to Europe and shaking Dutch confidence, rather than sort of achieving this massive military success in the moment. Merchants in Amsterdam hoarded guilders as markets plummeted anyway, and this, of course, was putting stress on the same Dutch capacity to field an adequate army. Concurrently, the bishops of Münster and Cologne had mobilized and invaded Overijssel on June the 1st with a combined force of 30,000 men. Right? These were ecclesiastical principalities of the empire. They sided with the French, putting together this sizable force that, as we've seen, was originally how many soldiers the Dutch had before they started ramping up their forces in view of the war. Bernard von Galen, nicknamed Bommenberend for his artillery expertise, captured Lingen and advanced into Twente, seizing Enschede, Almelo, and other towns with little opposition. The border population, some favoring union with Münster due to economic ties in this broader feudal background, or resentment, in fact, of Dutch taxation, was again the state, the republic, something different really from their more archaic traditional mindset, offered scant resistance, with villages like Oldenzaal, for example, surrendering to the ecclesiastical princes without a fight, their mayors negotiating favorable terms for their own communes. Von Galen's forces, reinforced by a French corps under Marshal Luxembourg, linked up with the main French army between Zutphen and Deventer, capturing Grohl on June the 10th and Bredevoort on June the 18th, after brief sieges that showcased von Galen's innovative use of mortars, by the way. You can check out the video made on the Valliere and Gerbevol systems, because the former was basically to be made exactly from Louis XIV's reign, and the French, for example, did not have a great deal of mortars by themselves. Deventer fell on June the 21st, followed by Zwolle, Atem, Elburg, and Ardeveg, as Overijssel's leadership, despairing of Dutch resistance, surrendered to Münster. Some cities like Zwolle declared allegiance to the Holy Roman Empire, by the way, and it's not like, in fact, the Dutch secession per se was to be intended in sort of teleologically deterministic ways. In fact, hoping here contingently for imperial protection by the same ecclesiastical princes from the French, because they knew that, of course, the Dutch Republic at that point could be destroyed, and they wanted to be shielded at that point. While local priests, sympathetic to Catholic Münster, urged compliance at the same time. The rapid collapse of Overijssel and parts of Gelderland shocked the Dutch, further exposing the fragility of their eastern defenses, in particular, because they had not much imagined that an attack of that scale could come from there as well, not just because of the French, but mostly, as we've seen, for these ecclesiastical principalities attacking their exposed flank. Also, the lack of a unified command from the Dutch side, and the failure of the IJssel line, which had to, in fact, provide with some defense from the west, but which was outflanked by French forces crossing the Rhine further south, rendering it irrelevant. The French pressed their advantage, splitting their forces to besiege multiple targets. Now, the Dutch hinterland was more exposed, and so they wanted to capitalize on it. Turenne attacked Arnhem, reducing its walls with heavy cannonades, while Louis himself targeted Duisburg which fell on June 21st, and his brother Philippe, the Duke of Orléans, took Zutphen shortly before, capturing 1,200 prisoners. Nijmegen's Fort Knotsenburg, isolated and bombarded, surrendered by July the 9th, and the French occupied Utrecht itself, an important center, on June the 30th, a devastating symbolic and strategic loss for the Dutch. Utrecht's city council, fearing plundering, surrendered without a fight, welcoming Louis with a ceremonial banquet that masked their humiliation, while Catholic citizens, suppressed under Dutch Protestant rule, quietly celebrated the French triumph. Naarden, only 24 kilometers from Amsterdam, fell on June the 19th, and Luxembourg's corps captured Gorkum, Best, and Fort Crèvecoeur by mid-July, securing the French southern flank of the theater. Louis, confident of imminent victory, considered besieging 's-Hertogenbosch, a prestigious but marsh-bound fortress. Nevertheless, the Dutch decision to open the dikes, ordered by William III on June the 8th as an act of desperation, began flooding the low-lying polders, complicating French siege operations more than much. By late June, in fact, the Holland waterline, a series of inundations protecting Holland, Zeeland, and parts of Utrecht, created an impassable barrier, transforming the flat landscape into a watery fortress that frustrated French engineers trained for traditional sieges. The flooding, which submerged farmland and displaced thousands of peasants, including from the Republic side, was a desperate sacrifice, with Amsterdam's burgomasters debating its economic cost, but ultimately prioritizing survival. It's interesting to see the lucidity of such, in the moment, unpopular decisions that, however, likely saved the Dutch at that point. The inundations were a desperate but ingenious tactic, in fact, rooted in Dutch mastery of water management. Amsterdam, with its 200,000 inhabitants by then, robust fortifications, and naval support, became an impregnable island, surrounded by these insidious marshes. The city's militia, reinforced by sailors, burghers, women, and even teenagers, bristled with thousands of cannons, making a siege of the city impracticable. The Zuiderzee, controlled by the Dutch navy, furthermore ensured constant resupply, as evidenced by the arrival of the lucrative India fleet, so-called in August, carrying spices, textiles, and porcelain worth millions of guilders, which stabilized Amsterdam's markets. The naval dimension was critical. On June the 7th, Admiral Michiel de Ruyter, by the way, this would be the proper name, I will probably be butchering Dutch, but anyhow, attacked, as you know, one of the greatest naval commanders of the modern age, the Anglo-French fleet at Solebay off the Suffolk coast, preventing a blockade of Dutch ports in the meanwhile. This was successful at, in fact, repressing especially English naval power. The battle, fought in dense fog, was tactically inconclusive, telling the truth, with both sides losing around 15 ships and 2,500 men. However, it secured Dutch control of coastal waters, because the Anglo-French plans were thwarted for carrying out further operations at those coasts for what would have been, intended as a landing in Zeeland, and therefore this action preserved Dutch trade routes vital to the Republic's economy. De Ruyter's leadership, celebrated in Dutch broadsides and tavern songs, boosted morale in this terrifying moment, with his portrait hung in guild halls across Holland, contrasting sharply with the land campaign's early disasters. This is how you regain confidence, even in the darkest of the hours. The French invasion had, generally speaking, triggered a profound political crisis within probably the same Dutch institutions. Public panic, as we've seen, together with outrage at the military collapse of the Dutch forces, fueled Orangist agitation against the States Party. Pamphlets circulated by a free press unmatched in Europe, right? The Dutch were among the most liberal regimes out there, accused regents of treason, corruption, and cowardice, while riots erupted in Holland's cities, Dordrecht, Haarlem, Rotterdam, and Amsterdam itself, demanding William's restoration as stadtholder. This is really typical of moments of crisis, especially when sort of things are going bad from a military point of view. You need a stronger authority, right? Even a stronger iron fist in a crackdown on dissent, a militarization, or if anything, an orientation towards a common goal of all elements of society. This was understood, of course, by the supporters of the same Orange. Crowds attacked regent homes, smashing windows and looting property, while Orange's propagandists distributed woodcuts glorifying William as a savior descended from the House of Orange's heroic past in the 80 Years' War. I made videos about Maurice of Nassau, but we will talk more about, we also talk about the Dutch school of military thought in the first half of the 17th century. It was largely sort of propaganda, it's idealism concerning how armies should have actually fought. In any case, the Dutch had secured at that point their own independence, and William seemed the fittest ruler at that point to take over and sort of change the situation. On July the 2nd, William was in fact appointed stadtholder of Zeeland, followed by Holland itself on July the 4th, ending the first stadtholderless period. The crisis culminated on August the 20th when an Orangist mob in The Hague, possibly with William's tacit approval, lynched Johan and Cornelis de Witt. The brothers were dragged from prison, shot and mutilated, their bodies hung upside down and disemboweled in a gruesome spectacle witnessed by thousands, with body parts sold as souvenirs. I also inserted some pictures of this here. William's ascension consolidated Orange's control, rallying the Dutch behind unified leadership, committed to resistance, though his role in the murders remains a subject of historical debate, with some sources suggesting he quietly condoned the violence to eliminate political rivals, while others argue he was powerless to stop the mob. Consider the Dutch had been really furious. I mean, during the iconoclastic distractions of at the beginning of the 80 Years' War, they really showed all their sort of aggressiveness, which was also quite prominent in their colonial posture, and that, however, was also needed for their international and here national success in self-defense. In the north, the Bishop of Münster continued his campaign. Meanwhile, after capturing Coevorden on July 11th, von Galen targeted Groningen, the linchpin of the northern Netherlands. As you know, we are essentially in the northeast, and on July the 19th, his army of 24,000, including French troops, arrived before the city, defended by Karl von Rabenhaupt with 2,200 regulars, 2,500 militia, and 1,400 reinforcement. This was not a soft nut to crack. Groningen's fortifications, bolstered by inundations, earthen ramparts, and a network of canals, withstood in fact von Galen's artillery, including his innovative incendiary shells, which caused fires but failed to breach the walls. All right, we discussed widely 17th century artillery, the limitations of what was largely, in fact, still a static warfare at large, revolving around sieges, not less than during the Middle Ages, possibly even more, given also the scale of operations in relative terms. So you could bombard the walls, but the enemy could sort of create makeshift barricades, defending the breach anyhow, because you have to send the troops in the breach to storm the walls to begin with. We've seen the gruesome paces of this in the sort of contemporary siege of Vienna, with more tactical details if you're interested as well. Dutch guerrilla tactics in Friesland is also quite interesting. This was led by Hans Willem van Eilva, who harassed the Münsterite supply lines, burning wagons and ambushing foraging parties, while local peasants hid livestock to starve the invaders. I made a video about the Dithmarscher that are a bit more distant from here, but they were still Frisians, and they had a history of sort of anti-nobiliar uprisings, and especially of ambushing in this quite sort of marshy lands. Frisia was definitely not, Holland was a pretty brutal, primitive, underdeveloped country, but historically it had bred this pretty tough and rough peasants who, a bit like, I don't know, the ones of the Appalachians during the War of American Independence, were not particularly interested in any broader intellectual ideal, whatever, but, they were always glad to pick up a weapon and going at it. And again, as we have explained here, don't let yourself be fooled by the Netherlands' flatness, all right? When, especially break the dams, but also in geographically in other areas that had not been reclaimed, this land becomes a veritable labyrinth. Perhaps you don't have many sort of visual limits. You can see what the enemy's up to, but getting through this, flooded land, marshy grounds, etc., trying to follow some just very thin, linear pathways is a veritable hell, right? And imagine a war zone in this situation, right? The Elector of Brandenburg's embargo on supplies from Emden, by the way, because the Hohenzollern were here backing France. Remember, the Swedes had entered war against them, so there was a broader sort of international cooperation here. Exacerbated shortages in the Netherlands. You know that historically, especially from the later Middle Ages, there was an important trade from the Baltics, especially in terms of raw material of grain, to this sort of rampant, especially like massively sort of developing, ever more populated northwestern European areas. So this was impacting as well. Just think the fields flooded, or this mess. While disease and desertion ravaged von Galen's ranks, as this malaise was not sparing the French in the region. By August the 27th, facing starvation and losses of 5,000 to 10,000 men, von Galen lifted the siege of Groningen, and this constituted an important Dutch victory celebrated as the Groning's onset. The failure cost Münster half of its army, by the way. They sort of engulfed themselves into it, admittedly, but as we've seen, it was part of a more coordinated effort with the French. There were French troops, and again, it was completely normal to lose more men to illness at some point than the gruesome, again, sort of type of combat that siege warfare entailed, traditionally speaking. But it was nevertheless a big loss in scale, in absolute terms, weakening properly Münster's position and especially boosting Dutch morale, which is exactly what the Republic needed. With church bells ringing across Holland and public feasts held in Groningen's Grote Markt, a lesser-known but significant victory also occurred at Aardenburg on June the 25th to 26th. Claude de Dreux, acting without orders, led 1,000 French troops against this town, defended by a garrison of 70 regulars and 50 inhabitants. So basically none. It was admittedly later reinforced by 450 troops. However, it seemed like a walk in the park. The defenders, instead, including women and teenagers, disguised the soldiers to inflate their numbers, repelled to disorganized assaults using makeshift barricades and small arms fire from church towers. The French, caught in a crossfire, lost over 1,000 men, with hundreds killed or captured, their bodies left in the streets as a warning, by the way. And this was, again, Dutch fury and sort of bloodthirstiness at its finest. This triumph, though minor really compared to French successes in general, demonstrated, however, in fact, Dutch resolve and the vulnerability of overconfident French commanders as well. Not like the French had a high reputation of the Dutch from this. I mean, nobody really had up to this point. It's just later, during, in fact, the following wars also with France, that the Dutch will start probably acquiring a reputation, a capacity to also to modernize, to innovate, providing with pretty solid infantry quality at large. Here we're almost, can't say a medieval context, but one that, as you understand, was not really served by a strong professional corps. Yet Louis, enraged by the unauthorized attack, as he had really normally control on everything, relieved de Dreux of command and criticized his recklessness. Signaling internal tensions within the French command structure that the Dutch later exploited through intelligence networks, including spies posing as deserters. Louis was a very cold person, telling you the truth, and so were basically almost all his generals, which really helped France in these campaigns. To an extent, there could be some level of French stubbornness and brutality, as we will see now, but at the same time, there were never rush decisions. So this minor one, of course, was authored by a lesser commander. Nevertheless, also the royal response shows how much the French here were organized, how much they cared about the general order and discipline of Louis' army. That was really something along that line. By late July, Louis, believing the Dutch defeated, you can never say, this is a big thing, by the way, it's really a big campaign, you can never fully say what's going on, especially with the general understanding of sort of the communications of the era, the general fog of war and more. The Sun King returned to France, leaving 40,000 men under Luxembourg in Utrecht. After all, the French had achieved a lot by capturing his fortresses, Utrecht as the major center. The king demanded harsh peace terms at Zeist on July the 12th, the cession of southern fortresses like Maastricht, Zertogenbosch, religious. I'm not sure I pronounce this correctly. It can be something perhaps more like Zertonenbosch, something like that. In any case, I'm not versed in Flemish. Now, this was all part, of course, of a broader European plan, involving, for example, the religious freedom for Catholics. Right? Louis XIV was the French king who revoked the Nantes Edict, religious freedom in France for good, expelling Huguenots, some of which had actually gone over to the Netherlands, but there were also lots of Catholics there historically, and things were not, say, religiously settled in Europe, as also the outcome of the 30 Years' War had basically sanctioned in an almost institutional way. The Sun King asked also for a 16 million livre payment to the fat Dutch, and an annual embassy to France, begging forgiveness to the Sun King. And these humiliating conditions, presented with theatrical arrogance, were intended to crush Dutch spirit, just telling you're basically lost. What are you even thinking, right? But instead, this had sort of an unwanted result, and in fact, the Republican resolve was hardened. The States of Holland, led by Amsterdam's resolute burgomasters like Gilles Valkenier, rejected the terms, with public assemblies in The Hague and Rotterdam, vowing to fight to the last man. After all, such a mess had happened that, also from a Dutch psychological perspective in this context, you would have kept fighting anyway, right? There wasn't much of a way to put together things at that point, and especially by sort of surrendering to the French. Naturally, the situation was very difficult, actually still desperate. William, in fact, negotiated, but in this sense obtained the delay of the capitulation, at least, leveraging the water line's defensive strength in sending envoys to stall French diplomats. Because naturally, much of the discussion revolved around when will you close the locks of the dams? When will you allow for the French army to actually pass through on dry land? The French, overstretched across dozens of captured fortresses, faced logistical strain. The advance had also been sort of rapid enough at the beginning, and also complicated by the flooded terrain that had somehow conferred the front some very irregular characteristic. And this hindered movement and siege operations for many reasons, understandably. Maintaining garrisons in places like Utrecht, Naarden, and Nijmegen required constant supplies, which Dutch raids and the Republic's control over river trade disrupted, forcing French troops to rely on extortion and foraging that alienated local populations, who began hiding food and sabotaging bridges in order to have the French fall back on sort of more interland position. Dutch diplomacy began thus to shift the war tide itself. Alarmed by French expansion, Brandenburg-Prussia, that had even supported the Sun King, imagine, like, again, everybody's playing for some stake, right? But when also your allies is overpowering, you have to slow down a little. Then the historical enemies, the Habsburgs, Spain, Emperor Leopold I, allied with the Republic by August. This was an important move. The Habsburgs had stayed out of the clash because, going at war with France was, a particularly heavy choice to make. But now, of course, here there is all the broader diplomatic background, also the entire sort of financial balance of Europe and so on at stake. This is exactly the moment in which you have to put pressure on France, if anything, to help the Dutch. The Elector of Brandenburg, Frederick William, mobilized 20,000 men to threaten French positions in the Rhineland. So again, this was former ally, but basically was taking advantage also of its German position to sort of put pressure in that area. Also because this reaffirmation of Catholic also restoration in Germany by the French seemed too much for Protestant powers, while Spain committed 15,000 troops to the Spanish Netherlands, who were still, of course, there and ruled by the Habsburgs, while the Holy Roman Empire dispatched 30,000 men, so a solid field army under the Feldmarschall, the Generalissimo, Raimondo Montecuccoli. Massive imperial warhound. Turenne, at this point, challenged, because also, the diet historically in the firmament is Montecuccoli, Turenne, with 25,000 men, moved east to counter these forces near Koblenz, while Luxembourg struggled to maintain control in Utrecht, where local resistance included sabotage, arson. Imagine living among a large population of people that dislike you. You can have sort of French soldiers with a slit throat at every corner, and false intelligence fed to French commanders by Dutch double agents. French forces extorted wealth from occupied territories. As we explained before, the French really believed to be the rulers of Europe. They thought of the Dutch very poorly. They burned villages like Bodegraven and Zwammerdam, and massacring civilians with up to 2,000 killed in December alone. Right? Think about the 80 Years' War, memories from that. And these things were actually normal for the sort of warfare of the year, but were obviously triggered by some gratuitous violence as well, aside also from practical purpose, so to say. A bit of terrorism was aimed definitely at sort of breaking Dutch morale, also just foraging, pillaging, plundering. These atrocities fueled Dutch propaganda with engravings and pamphlets distributed across Europe via the Republic's free press. Just think about, things that happen today in general. Like, everybody knows in a moment what's going on, and there is outrage about stuff, regardless of any political reference in particular. But imagine, the effort and the desperation for what was happening in the Netherlands at the time, prompting the same country to properly send these pamphlets and say, how could you... There were ways to verify this, especially by governments. Those who needed to know this stuff actually knew it, right? But there is also a greater propagandistic effort here. The Republic Free Press depicted French soldiers looting churches, murdering peasants, and burning homes. Naturally, they were overtly characterized as such. The French were doing something similar, but of course, the war was also that brutal. These accounts, though sometimes exaggerated, portrayed Louis XIV as a tyrant, undermining his image as a disciplined monarch and swaying public opinion in England, Germany, and Spain, where crowds in London and Vienna protested French aggression. In October, William of William III, launched a counteroffensive to disrupt French supply lines. A feint on Naarden drew Luxembourg away from Utrecht, allowing William's 8,000 men to attack Verden on October the 10th. The French garrison of 2,000 led by the Comte de la Marque repelled the assault, and Luxembourg's rapid return with 3,000 troops outflanked the Dutch. This brought to a fierce 5-hour battle, after which the French Navarre regiment captured Dutch trenches and fortifications, forcing William's retreat with heavy losses. Both sides suffered around 1,000 casualties, but the engagement demonstrated the Dutch army's growing confidence, resolve, and ability to challenge the French. This, as we've seen, had basically just been left to single communities, very often sort of at a small scale, with other bigger cities taken over by the French very swiftly. In fact, victory remained elusive for the Dutch. William's leadership, though untested, inspired loyalty among his troops. He didn't really have much of a military curriculum at this point. The Dutch began to see William as a symbol of resistance, with soldiers chanting his name in campfires and townfolk erecting statues in his honor, thinking at the old glories of the Orange back in national history. It was not even that distant, chronologically speaking. In the north, Dutch forces under Rabenhaupt struck a decisive blow on December the 30th. Imagine also the climate here, recapturing Coevorden. Exploiting frozen canals in a plan by local schoolmaster Meindert van der Thijnen, the Dutch constructed, I'm butchering Dutch pronunciation, I'm here between a piece of track and another checking the accurate phonetics, but there are too many names. I can't check it for all of them. The Dutch followers will forgive me. Well, but this bridge of reeds to cross the moat, capturing 600 Münsterite soldiers and 85 cannons in a surprise attack. This victory, by the way, eliminated Münster's foothold in Drenthe and secured the northern provinces for the Dutch, with church services across Friesland giving thanks for the deliverance. There's a strong sense of Christian, faith in this military struggle, almost an apocalyptic scenario. If anything, just by landscape, by season, by the looming force of the Sand King over the Dutch. Earlier, Friesland's defenses, led by Ailva, Johann Maurits von Nassau, and Hendrik Casimir II, repelled Münsterite attacks also at Heerenveen. This happened on September the 8th and 9th, safeguarding the province of the Zuiderzee trade route. These successes, combined with the Groning's onset, restored Dutch control over this northeastern frontier, bolstering morale and weakening Münster's position in the coalition as well. They had limited resources, after all. They couldn't simply protract the war in the Netherlands as nothing were. With von Galen's reputation suffering as his troops deserted en masse, by the way, evidently showing the collapse also the capacity of sort of paying them, giving them something to fight for. By late 1672, the French offensive had thus stalled. Right, it was normal also in general during the dark season for things to slow down. Right, so this massive, gigantic expedition had started in basically late spring, mid-spring, but by looking at Dutch weather in general, like this was there was just a very specific window for achieving very specific objectives. The Holland waterline, in particular, harsh winter conditions. You fight also in winter. That's not just this is not Siberia. But in fact, mostly the Dutch forces, Dutch guerrilla raids, strained French logistics, with garrisons spread thin across the occupied territories. In December, Luxembourg attempted to march on The Hague with 8,000 men crossing frozen canals in a bold bid to crush Dutch resistance at that point. A sudden thaw forced a retreat, though, and his forces massacred civilians in Bodegraven and Zwammerdam, as we were talking about before. This is where the thousands were killed in a spree of looting and burning that left entire villages in ashes. So it's not like the Dutch did not really pay for this. You have the Hollandse Mercurius publishing the atrocities, as we were saying before. English parliamentarians at this point cited these very sources to pressure Charles II to withdraw from the war. And of course, the crypto-Catholicism, the general sort of tension after the restoration between the king and the parliament in England was a very delicate issue. Thus, the Rampjaar, though a near catastrophe, marked a turning point for the Dutch Republic. William III's leadership, the Holland waterline, and naval victories preserved the core provinces of Holland and Zeeland exactly within this year. This is important because, as we explained, as you know, the war dragged on for years, right, and engulfed Europe to an important extent. We will at some point talk about all these various wars also in greater detail. Again, this is just, for example, a year of a particular war, and we have just looked at the broader political, strategical context, but there's naturally much more to dig into. We haven't focused our attention on specific battles, etc. So we also stopped to this year for this reason, to look at how think about, the war in Ukraine, just looking at what happened in 2022, settling the pattern for, like in this case, an attritional clash. Just for not leaving you without some further spoiler, by early 1673, the Dutch had regained Coverton and parts of Drenthe, while alliances with Spain and Brandenburg and the Holy Roman Empire shifted the war's balance in general. The French, now facing a broader European coalition, in fact transitioned to a war of attrition, also including the outer fronts, focusing on securing gains in the Spanish Netherlands, as well as in the Rhineland. And as we've seen, the Imperials had mobilized the Spanish to... the Dutch Republic was battered but unbroken, emerging with renewed resolve. William III, now stadtholder and captain general, became the linchpin of resistance, his leadership forging a new national identity rooted in defiance. Much of what we know as the Netherlands as a thoroughly successful nation is exactly sort of founded exactly in the flooded farms of the 1672 campaigns in many ways. Thus, the events of this year not only tested the Republic's survival, but also reshaped its political landscape, ending the regent-dominated era, which, as we've seen, was basically a moment of broader relaxation, right? The Netherlands couldn't quite just go on with a sort of loosely Republican establishment. And we witness instead to the cementing of William's authority as a European monarch, statesman. The war, now part of the broader Franco-Dutch War, set the stage for decades of conflict, also beyond the same war and moments of peace, with the Dutch Republic, as we've seen also in other videos, emerging as a resilient symbol of resistance against French hegemony, probably regardless of geographical proximity to France being historically something very different and even more differentiating in this regard. A legacy that would influence European politics through, for example, the 9 Years' War, we mentioned before, the War of Spanish Succession. And as you know, I'm basically making ever more videos about these phases. The human cost, by the way, thousands of civilian deaths, right, razed villages and a traumatized population, underscored the stakes, while the Republic's survival testified to its ingenuity, unity, and determination. Celebrated also in Dutch art, poetry, and sermons that immortalized this Rampjaar as a testament to national endurance. Unlike in other places of Europe, like, for example, Poland, that were becoming increasingly dependent on other people's powers, and including the French, for that matter. So, again, there is really a lot to say about this context, including, again, what it means to be, a Dutch peasant of the late 17th century that has to witness this French onslaught, but being already part of a subtle system that is starting to pivot on something more consistent, more politically and strategically planned, organized, and gearing up for war. The Dutch army will be famous, as we said before. It will essentially be the most cost-effective army in history, financially wise, and it really acquired also a reputable sort of level of quality at the time when compared, in fact, to the same French, to the British. The English will actually model themselves because they hadn't also, but Cromwell had been an important sort of parenthesis in the development of the English army and state. We will never made videos about Cromwell and the new model army, but we will get there. But in general, like the British, will start, as we've seen with Marlborough, properly intervening in the European continental balance directly with their boots on the ground over there, modeling their own doctrine on the achievements of the Dutch exactly within this decade, right? Because before they had not had to go sort of Moscow to Moscow by the new scale of sort of, armies by size in the art of war right now. In fact, that had to respond to the Sun King's forces ever before. Like, this is a very different era in military history, and they did so on the basis of the Dutch bond. From the Allied side of what will become, again, everybody against the French, and later the Spanish, of course, during the War of Spanish Succession, given that the Bourbon had acquired the throne as well, which, as you've seen here, is not even the case. The English are even fighting against the Dutch in this war, if anything at sea, however. So very interesting chapter in European warfare. I like sort of to provoke you with this bits because with Schwerpunkt I really can at this point concentrate much more on warfare in general and offering probably something I never had before on the channel. And it's important to really complete all these various things. I mean, before we mentioned Turenne, Montecuccoli, we never really talked about their famous Rhineland campaign, that they stem exactly from these clashes. But they require also much greater background. Again, I still haven't finished the series even about Dutch warfare. Admittedly, this is the 9th video about Dutch history. It's mostly about warfare, and we talked partially about sort of different aspects, especially of 17th century, mostly the 80 Years' War and its legacy in the Netherlands. We made also something about properly the medieval Netherlands. So it's important to increase this kind of content. We have really to talk more about the French army itself, because technically this video was mostly intended as, let's talk about French military history. As well here, the French were investing more. They were the invaders. So there is all, as we said before, hegemonic continental ambition and planning from Louis XIV side that I hope we will explain better in a dedicated video. This video, if anything, shows how a major invasion can be bogged down even when the enemy is much smaller than the invader, even than a 1-3 simile. Naturally, odds were being rebalanced, but as you've seen here, this is also completely normal. At some point, the offensive reaches its sort of apex, and if it hasn't broken through decisively, it stalls, and you also have to fall back in previous positions, not to endanger, not to lose too much. From the defender side, you have a complete scramble, major crisis, but one that gives a hell of a push, right, spurring further the defensive. Even with such drastic solutions like flooding the entire country to stall the enemy advance, which, however, also succeeded. And even though by the end of 1672, nobody knew, let's say, how things could go, because everything could change, at least a very important part of the work had been done, and especially the risk of having probably the Dutch collapse and losing, say, The Hague, for example, was averted. And even though, again, Dutch losses were pretty high, still the French invasion failed. All right. Again, we will definitely come back on similar topics. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoy this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.